primarily for posterity, for my sisters and their families, and for my family, and for my dad's birth family, and for anyone that's interested in finding a missing piece of their history. It's written in a series of letters, love letters actually, to my dad, who died in 1990, never knowing the story of his birth, which he so longed to know. So just for a minute, I'd just like to read the introduction so you'll get where I'm coming from. I've been told that knowing your past helps to shape your present and understand who you are as a person. I don't know if that has been my drive over these many years to find my father's birth family, but what I do know is the lack of knowledge of my father's birth and circumstances surrounding it have gnawed at me for as long as I can remember. I started this journey of discovery with fervor well over 20 years ago, but the seed was really planted in my psyche when I was quite small. My dad's parents were long gone from this earth before my birth in 1951. My maternal grandmother, Abigail Harrington Healy, had died as well. Abby's husband, my grandfather, Mike Healy, died in a car accident when I was only 2. I longed for the grandparents my cousins and friends had. It seemed such an important part of one's childhood to have doting grandparents. Since the time I knew my dad was adopted, I imagined a grandmother or grandfather out there waiting with open arms to meet the grandchildren they never knew. Looking back, it was fun, but certainly not very practical. To imagine such a scenario when everything was so hushed regarding out-of-wedlock pregnancies and subsequent adoptions. I was told in my early teens that my dad's birth mother may have died in a boating accident, a fact I quickly dismissed as that certainly did not fit into my happily ever after. In our adult lives, my sisters and I had many conversations with our dad regarding his adoption. He deeply loved Helen and Richard Bowman, the parents who adopted him. However, there was something missing in his life that he often found hard to express. One thing for certain, Dad had an underlying need to know the circumstances of his birth and why he was given up for adoption. And always he wondered if he had an extended family out there somewhere. My journey to find my dad's birth family has been a successful one, and I have come to know many new family members and their stories. Within these pages, I honor those stories. I have, through the past several years, established great affection for the family my father so longed to know. For the most part, they have welcomed me with open arms and are fascinated by the story we share. But as in any story such as this, there were those who feel I have overstepped my bounds and that the mystery of my father's birth should have stayed thus. In a sense, I understand their denial because sometimes the truth can shatter an image that's been well sculpted and preserved over the years. My intention, of course, would never be to do harm to the woman and man who gave life to my father. I believe my work here serves to honor them and all who played such a critical role in my dad's life and who indirectly helped shape the lives of his children. Okay. When I embarked on this journey of discovery, I had limited tools, but there were 3 significant pieces of information that would drive my search and ultimately solve the mystery of my dad's birth family. The first had to do with a chance meeting in Seattle during World War II. My mother was there to be the maid of honor for a friend of hers, and she ran into a childhood friend of my father's who was there on leave before heading to the South Pacific. His name was Frank Birmingham, and he was affectionately known as Razzie. And Razzie had a story for my mother. He shared with her a story that he learned from his own mother, who was a neighbor and a dear friend of Helen Bowman, the woman my dad adored and called Mom. He told my mother that my dad's birth mother was a nurse who lived on the Anaconda Road and was a daughter to a big shot with an Anaconda company. He relayed that this woman, my dad's birth mother, died in a boating accident on Lake Tahoe, California. He also mentioned a Dr. Edward McGinn as part of adoption, but not certain what his role would be. Dr. McGinn would surface throughout my research. Sadly, Frank Razzie Birmingham would die a short time later in the South Pacific when his plane, returning from a bombing run, was forced to ditch in the ocean after being waved off in an attempt to land on the carrier Corregidor. His gunner and radio man were saved, but Frank Razzie Birmingham drowned, and he was buried at sea. A heartbreaker for my father. Look at me go, I haven't anything to say. The second piece of information was helpful, but it was misleading. In the early 1970s, my dad was able to secure his adoption records from the Butte courthouse. He was adopted by Helen and Rich Bowman on New Year's Eve of 1919 when he was just short of 8 weeks old. It shows his birth mother to be a Josephine Brown, and his given name Joseph Brown. Josephine Brown, I would later learn, was an alias for Lydia Carver. Years of research regarding Josephine Brown led nowhere, of course, and only muddied my research. The third piece of information that put the final pieces of my story together was DNA. I was the first of my family to submit a file and send off to Ancestry. My mother and 4 sisters would also submit a test, and later cousins, my children, as well as nieces and nephews. It was important to have my mother do this, so when I was looking over matches, I could see who were related to my mother, and by process of elimination, know who my father's family was. This just shows the centimorgans. That's my son, and then my daughter, and then my mother. That's the order of centimorgans, and then my sisters would follow, and cousins, and so forth. So where was I? Anyway, without this story from Ramsey and the DNA, my story would not be possible, and without the Butte Archives, there would be no color or life to my story. For it was through my research here that I was able to give life to the facts of my father's birth, through resources like the federal census, Find a Grave website, local government records, newspaper.com, school census records, births and death records, immigration files, Butte characters, yearbooks, and so much more. This place is really a treasure. My story begins in the mining town of Hayton, Michigan, where Lydia Carpenter, alias Josephine Brown, was born the 5th of 7 children to machine school teacher William Carpenter and his wife Margaret Sullivan Carpenter. William and Margaret had met in the mining town of Hayton, married and gave life to 7 children in the span of 11 years. Only one of those 7 children would live to see grandchildren. The family's first heartache, was William, twin to Margaret, 3rd and 4th in family lineup. William died at 5 months. Although there was little known about sudden infant death syndrome at the time, through my research, I think that was how William died. The second of their heartache was 6th in line, Gladys, who fell in a mining waterway while following her siblings to school one day and drowned. And their last born, Frederick, died 5 years after Gladys from infantile convulsions. At that time, William and Margaret had to have been in pieces. William was soon offered the position of assistant superintendent of machinery for the Anaconda Company, and William and Margaret moved with their 4 surviving children to Butte, Montana in 1913. Margaret had several Sullivan family members living in Butte and Anaconda, and the family welcomed the opportunity for a new beginning. They settled in without complication, living first to the left on Main Street, and then 1117 Diamond. The eldest 2 children, Sheas and Catherine, were soon off to Michigan to college, and young Margaret and Lydia enrolled in Butte High School. Sorry, that's Lydia, I know. Margaret Sullivan's relatives in the area included her sister Mary Sullivan Collier Johnson, who at one time was a teacher in Butte. Widowed, she started the Collier Preparatory School in Anaconda and later married an Anaconda businessman, R.R. Johnson. She was active in the suffrage movement and was the first woman to register to vote in Deer Lodge County. She would later run unsuccessfully as a Republican for county superintendent of schools. Yes, there's a Republican in my family. After graduating high school in 1913 and while studying nursing at St. James Hospital, young Margaret, twin to William, who had died at 5 months, contracted typhoid fever from a patient and died at the tender age of 17. William and Margaret buried their 4th child, this time at Holy Cross Cemetery in Butte. The 3 remaining children were now Sheas, Catherine, and Lydia. Within a short time, William was promoted to general manager of machinery for the Anaconda Company, and the family moved to 446 Anaconda Road. After graduating from Butte High, Lydia left for Wisconsin to study home economics at the University of Wisconsin-Stout. This is her high school graduation picture. At the time, Sheas was home in Butte, living at 423 South Dakota and working as a clerk in the Leonard Mine. He was also serving as secretary for the stockholders for the Montana Reliance gold mines. Catherine had returned from college to Butte and married a man named Cyrus Dorr. His grandmother, Julia Carolyn Ripley Dorr, was a noted author in Minnesota. Catherine and Cyrus soon became parents to daughter Julia. After finishing school, Lydia returned to Butte to teach at Washington Junior High, approved by the Butte School Board, one member of that board being a Dr. Edward McGinn. Cellist was in officers training in Washington State. Catherine's husband, Cyrus, had left his job as manager of the professional building in Butte to sell war bonds in Kansas and then Wisconsin. I think there was probably some marital problems there. And Catherine and her young daughter, Julia, moved to the Anaconda Road as well, just a block or so from her parents. And an interesting aside from that, my friend Shelley is here, Shelley Vernon's whore, and her grandmother lived on the Anaconda Road, and she called me after reading the book, and she said, that was my house, that was my grandmother's house that Catherine and Julia lived in. So small world, but typical, I think, of Butte, Montana. Hello? Okay. Let's see. Months later, while volunteering for the Red Cross, Catherine contracted scarlet fever, and she died at the age of 24, leaving her 2-year-old daughter, Julia, motherless. Dr. McGinn signed her death certificate. The Anaconda Standard, April 22nd, 1918, reads, the funeral of Mrs. Catherine Carpenter Dorr, wife of Cyrus Dorr, will be held this morning at the home of her parents, Mr. and Mrs. W.E. Carpenter, 446 Anaconda Road. High Mass will be celebrated at St. Mary's at 10 o'clock. Burial will be at the Holy Cross Cemetery. Mrs. Dorr was a graduate of Ann Arbor, Michigan High School and attended the University of Michigan. Life had to have been most difficult for your grandparents' dad after Catherine's death. And when one just couldn't fathom any more tragedy for the Carpenter family, Cyrus Dorr, now a Marine, took his own life on December 4th, 1918. It was just 8 months after Catherine's death, and it seemed 6 months after marrying a Margaret Punchaletta on June 8, 1918. The newspaper account of his death said he was passing through Nashville, Tennessee, and stopped at a shooting range where he shot himself. Something heavy had to have been on the heart and mind of Cyrus Dorr. According to an informational website I found, mehereRightNowBlog.com, Cyrus Dorr's ashes were never claimed by his family. Perhaps the stigma of suicide back then, or perhaps the estrangement came from his quick marriage after Catherine's death. A group called Missing in America had located and identified Cyrus's remains, housed in a Nashville mortuary since 1918. Through this group in 2011, which is almost 100 years later, Cyrus was buried at the National Cemetery at Leavenworth, Kansas with full military honors. I further found a 2016 memorial on the Find a Grave website from the Sherlock cousins. Quote, it says, for whatever problem you may have had, you are remembered this Memorial Day. The tragic end to Cyrus's young life left young Julia an orphan in the care of your grandmother, Dad, whose state of mind at this point had to have been very fragile. Your grandfather, William, had his work with the Anaconda Company for diversion from his grief, but Margaret, now raising a young child, had no rest. The remainder of that grief was all around her, to remind her. Catherine was buried next to her sister Margaret at Holy Cross Cemetery with no grave marker, which my family's going to do something about that. An ironic twist to all of this is that they are directly behind my mother's aunt's grave in Holy Cross Cemetery, a grave my family, including my father, visited often. Life went on for the Carpenter family, but it couldn't have been easy. William was head of all the mining machinery for the Anaconda Company. Margaret was raising a young grandchild, Julia, and battling depression, and from what I can gather, was not up to the job. Their 2 remaining children were finding their way. Cellist had gone through officers training and served in the military on the European front and was in law school in San Francisco. And Lydia was teaching school in Butte, she was also registered as a Democrat. She was a rebel. Besides her teaching, Lydia was also working in some type of nursing capacity for the Red Cross. One granddaughter suggested in lieu of her home ec degree, perhaps as a dietitian. Anyway, Razzie's information was that she was a nurse. It was in that role that she would meet Kenneth Sternal, who had worked as a salesman for Goodyear Tire. Kenneth enlisted in the service, but because of a skull fracture was not eligible for active duty and was one of several men sent to Missoula to train for skilled work needed in the military. he would have been getting services from the Red Cross. I believe an affair ensued, and my father, Richard Bowman, was a result of that tryst. I have no knowledge of the circumstances around it, however. Interestingly enough, I found my dad's birth father, Kenneth Sternal, first. He was the youngest of 7 children of John and Elizabeth Wiggins Sternal. His father was a prominent cattleman in California, and his mother the daughter of Judge Wiggins. His brother John had several mining interests in the area. This is a picture of Ken in later years with his wife. I couldn't find a younger one of them. There's a blurred area regarding the birth and a few months up until my dad was adopted. And I had several leads, but none were really definitive. Looking for Josephine for many years, my mother found in the 1920 census a Josephine Brown in the Stevens building across from the liquor store. Everybody know that building? It doesn't show her having a job. It was known that there was a madam and several ladies of the evening that lived there. In my early research, I thought that that was the story. And quite frankly, I admired her for following through. But as we know now, that wasn't the story. During this time, Lydia was working on the A-team selling war bonds at the corner of Broadway and Park, where the Stevens building is. Note that the captain of the team is Dr. Edward McGinn's wife. Maybe Lydia and Josephine met, and maybe she was asked or hired to be mother during the adoption. Also, I had found in the 1920 census, while putting in a word search for Joseph Brown, a family, Mary and Ray Brown, who had 5 children. Does anybody know Carrie Brown Powers? Remember Carrie and Judy Powers? This would be her mother. Anyway, she was a lovely lady. And I discussed this with her daughter, Judy, who said that she knew nothing of 2 younger children. In school census and in later census, the younger 2 were not a part of the family. I had worked with Carrie at one time, and I remember she told me that her maiden name was Brown, and I said, oh, that was my dad's birth name. And she asked me if my dad was a twin. And I said, no, now, why would I say that? I knew nothing about that. And oh, I would love to go back and have that conversation with her again. But here was this Dorothy and Joseph on the census with these people. So maybe, just maybe, that Mary Joseph used the name Josephine Brown when she delivered my father over to the courts. I don't know if this Dorothy was from another family, the younger girl, or if in fact my dad had a twin. I lost her there. I can't find her anymore. So, and finally, it's my belief that there would be no way Lydia would have stayed in Butte during her pregnancy. She would have gone many places, including Anaconda. I found an interesting school board meeting on the school board that I want to share with you. It says, school board meets to hear recommendations. Very little business done at the session of the trustees. Very little business was transacted last night by the Board of School Trustees. The Educational Committee recommended the appointment of Ruby Hodgkins as teacher of home economics at the Washington Junior High. The recommendation was confirmed. Lydia Carpenter, she was taking Lydia Carpenter's place at the junior high. Lydia Carpenter, a teacher at Washington Junior High School, was ordered transferred to Butte High School. Lydia, there was no sign of anybody that had retired from Butte High School that was a home ec teacher, and they wouldn't have hired another teacher because at this period of time there were a shortage of students, and so they were laying teachers off. So I just firmly believe in my heart that this is what Dr. McGinn did, being on the school board, to give her an avenue to leave and save face. In March of 2018, I filled out an application to conduct research in the confidential records of the Butte School District held by the Butte-Silver Bow Archives. I mean, they have so much here. I was in search of documentation for a leave of absence for Lydia, as well as a document showing her signature. I thought it was important to have her signature. Anyway, they worked with me for days, going through all the files, and I was able to find either one of those. I also contacted the college that she went to, Wisconsin Stout, to see if maybe they had a record of her signature. And they looked for days, but they said after 100 years it was just too difficult for them to find that. Let's see. Am I on this next one? Okay. After After my dad's birth, Lydia would teach in Butte for about another year. In spring of 1921, because the post-war economy in Butte was bleak and enrollment gradually had been going down, the school board, in spite of Dr. McGinn's objections, was looking to save $115,000 and laid off 41 teachers, and Lydia Carver being one of them. She would pack up and move to San Francisco, where her brother Sheas was. My dad, Richard Bowman, did that move?
Yeah.
It did?
Yes.
Okay. My dad, Richard Bowman, alias Joseph Brown, was born November 4th, 1919. He was adopted on New Year's Eve of that year. The judge presiding was Edward M. Lamb. I had trouble finding him at the courthouse where pictures of what I thought were all of the district judges through the years were displayed outside the chambers. And I asked several of the judges up there, and they said, we don't know, but Edward Lamb. I came to the archives for help because I couldn't read it. And Jim McCarthy, do you remember that, Jim? You said that says Edward Lamb. And then Harriet went downstairs, and she found a log of this doctor, or of this judge's, his log, his daily log, that is also housed here. So he was a judge here. I looked in the log the day my dad was adopted, and there was no record of that, but there was other adoptions in his log record, so I knew that that wasn't something that they didn't put in there. So I asked Lori Maloney, the former clerk of the court, about that, and she said, sometimes when it's hush-hush, and when the people involved are friends of the judge, all procedures go on in the private quarters of the judge, and the clerk would not have been involved, and there would have been no record of it. So Helen and Richard Bowman were delighted with their baby son. They named him Richard Bowman. They had both been married before. Helen was married to a Peter LeClair. Both immigrated from Quebec, Canada, and ended up for a time in Cleveland, Ohio. Helen would stay there with an older adopted child, Katie, from Ireland. I assume they took custody of Katie maybe after her parents died. Peter was a drunk and an abuser, and when he left his family to move to Butte, Montana, he left his family then to move to Butte, Montana. So a little bit about him. An article I found in the April 21st, 1902 edition of the Montana Standard reads, Peter LeClair, an engineer and until recently employed by various mines in Butte, met with an accident yesterday forenoon, which necessitated his being first taken to the city jail and later to the county institution for treatment. Although not seriously hurt, he was in rather nervous condition, and it was thought best to take him somewhere where he could be watched. It further stated LeClair in some manner lost his footing and fell down a flight of stairs, striking his head and shoulder. When taken to the city jail, jailers thought the man somewhat despondent, aside from being badly bruised from the fall, so they locked him up in one of the detention rooms until he was removed to the county jail. Later in the afternoon, a friend brought him a bottle of whiskey and some cigars, but it was thought best not to give the man any whiskey at the time. You can't make this stuff up. However, the Butte Daily Post same day reported him in serious condition as a result of his head hitting the steps as he fell at the Swiss home, which was a boarding house. It further states, of late years, he's had much trouble, and his wife, who resides in Cleveland, Ohio, with their child, is now suing for divorce. The unfortunate man feels keenly his position. Papers were a few days ago served upon LeClair, notifying him of his wife's application in the Ohio courts for separation. She charges in her complaint that LeClair had been a habitual drunkard for a period of 3 years. He had friends in Butte, and an effort will be made in a few days to do something for him. At present he is in pitiable condition, both body and mind. Peter must have promised sobriety to gain his wife Helen and child back, collecting them from Ohio and bringing them back to Butte. I found him back in employment at the mines in 1906 and in 1907, and then he was gone again. Helen and Katie worked in various laundries. I have no idea what happened to Katie. Richard Bowman Sr.'s first wife came to Butte and then just couldn't handle this mining town, and she deserted him as well. And took her 2 children with him, and she remarried twice again. So they had desertion in common when they married. When my dad was quite young, neighbor children came, told him he was adopted. I assume one of those was probably Rosie Birmingham. My dad went home and asked his mother, who started crying, and she locked herself in her room. Knowing that it was breaking her heart, he never mentioned it to her again. She died when he was 28, and they never again had that conversation. Dad was active in Boy Scouts, attended St. Joseph's School, Boys Central, and Butte High School, and was all city full back. He dropped out of school twice to work to help his mother, as his father was in Galen, dying from consumption after years of working in a mine. When my father was 16 years old, his birth mother, Lydia Carpenter, now living in California in the Bay Area, now mother of Margie and Billy, died in a boating accident at Lake Tahoe. Tracy Thornton found this article for me from the Montana Standard, Sunday, July 21st, 1935. Word of Mrs. Bowtow's death in California received here. Word of the death by drowning of Mrs. E.P. Bowtow, formerly Lydia Carpenter, Butte school teacher in Lake Tahoe, was received with regret by friends in both Butte and Anaconda yesterday. A 7-year-old Californian, Tommy O'Connor, in Tuolumne Meadows of California, was drowned when he heroically attempted to save a former Butte resident, according to a dispatch. Besides the 2 dead, 16 other persons escaped death when a speedboat containing 9 persons and piloted by C.D. Woods of San Francisco struck a rowboat of Dr. and Mrs. Thomas O'Connor, parents of the drowned boy. Survivors said the darkness prevented either boat from seeing the other until just before the crash. It was reported as the worst marine accident in 22 years on Lake Tahoe. Excuse me. She is survived by her husband, E.P. Bowtow of San Francisco, 2 children, Marjorie and Billy, who were with her at the time of the accident but were rescued, her father and mother, Mrs. W.C. Carpenter of Arizona, and a brother, the only surviving child, and sister-in-law, Mr. and Mrs. Chellis Carpenter of San Francisco, an aunt, Mrs. R.R. Johnson of Anaconda, a cousin, Mrs. Oli McDougall McGinn of Butte, Mrs. Maurice Trask of Anaconda, lifelong friend of Mrs. Bowtow, received the message. So, here we come. This is a picture of my dad about the time that he heard about his mother. Handsome little bugger, wasn't he? When my mother and father were to be married in 1947, my mother was working at the telephone company and she was able to locate Dr. McGinn's address in Los Angeles. They wrote to Dr. McGinn telling him they understood he was involved in my dad's adoption and requesting my dad's ethnicity. Dr. McGinn wrote back, not acknowledging he knew anything of the adoption, but only saying, "You are American, of course." Okay, even though this letter sent to my mother and father was abrupt and clearly he did not want to get involved, I came to have an appreciation for Dr. McGinn and his loyalty and affection for the Brown family. My father was a wonderful person, loved so by his wife and 5 daughters and 12 grandchildren. He went on with his life, but I can tell you the circumstances of his birth were always on his mind. He died in October of 1990 from prostate cancer, never knowing his birth family. He had promised me when he retired we would research his birth, but his health circumstances got in the way of that. His last years were spent wrapped in love. It was years after his death that DNA became available for genealogy purposes. As I told you, my first contacts were my dad's families. A long story that we don't have time to get into now, but one day a Nancy Sherrick Moore popped up on my Ancestry as a second cousin. She's an artist. And she was not related on my mother's nor on my cousin on the Dernal side, so this contact had to have been related to my dad's birth mother. Her son-in-law, Ed Truthen, who was monitoring her site, arranged for us to have a phone conversation. She was lovely to talk to. She had a Brown connection on her father's side and was hoping that that was our connection, as she was estranged from her mother at an early age when her mother left her father, Nancy, and her 3 sisters for the parish priest. It was, however, on her mother's side we were related, and her mother was Julia, the 2-year-old daughter of Catherine when Catherine died. Over months, Nancy and I corresponded, and she told me a little about our great-grandparents, William and Margaret, and what little she knew about Lydia's family. As I recall, she couldn't remember the last name of Lydia's grandchildren, but would keep thinking. She had me contact her half-sister Elaine, who was the daughter of Julia and the priest. My conversations with Elaine about her life in various countries with her mother and her father was so interesting and a little sad. She never got to know her half-sisters until she was an adult. Nancy and Elaine's mother, Julia, and the priest would split years later, and Julia would marry an ex-boyfriend of her daughter's, Elaine's. The priest died when he was hit by a car while he was out for a walk. As an aside, Elaine and Nancy are steeped in Buddhism, which to me is about peace and love. And according to Elaine, it's been the linchpin of her life, giving her courage, wisdom, and determination to face all of the obstacles in her life. They're really two wonderful, unique people. It was a while before I had another significant link on Ancestry, but when it came up, it was a doozy. Beth Heron showed up on my site, second cousin, 298 centimorgans, which could mean a second cousin, a first cousin once removed, or a half first cousin. I'm going to show you this. This is a centimorgan chart. It's not very clear. Sorry about that. I should have made it bigger. But anyway, it gives you a range and various things that when you have those amount of centimorgans that you fill into. I contacted Beth and asked what she knew of her grandmother. She said very little, as she had died in a boating accident when her mother was quite young. Where was that boating accident, I asked. Lake Tahoe, she said. Bingo. I then told her my story. She told me she had 8 living siblings. 1 had died. This is their mother with all 10 siblings. She was Margie, and she would be my dad's half-sister. My sisters and I found this, my sister Maureen's over there, she'll attest to this. We found this interesting because there are 5 girls in my family, and my mother had 1 professional picture taken with our oldest sister, and the rest of us not so much. and Maureen tells the story that she said the pictures that she had, you could put in an envelope with a thank you note. A little bit exaggerated. Anyway, Beth asked me to contact her cousin Noelle. And Noelle was not a cousin of ours, but Noelle had worked with people that were searching for their birth families. And she was just, when I called her, she was driving, she said, let me pull over. And she just could not believe the information I had and the centimorgans and the connection. And she said, will you send me a picture of your dad? And I said, well, sure. So I sent her well, that's not it. Well, it'll come up later, I guess. Anyway, I sent her a picture of my dad, and it was just unbelievable how they all looked alike. What should we do with that picture? Anyway, this is, I was quickly embraced by Beth's brother Robert and sister Lenny, but I have to tell you, this one sister's husband was not happy, and he let me know there was never any indication of a 3rd child of Lydia Carpenter. I told him, of course, that was the point. My dad was adopted, names were changed, and records sealed. In later correspondence, he told me because we don't have my dad's DNA nor Lydia's, he could not accept us, but would consider us a relative as all Irish were related. She closed with this, quote, to become pregnant out of marriage, someone had to have sex out of marriage, and that is wrong. And certainly a woman of that time would have considered that wrong. As flawed as that analogy was to me, I respected his view and let it go at that. Yeah. This summer, they came to visit us. And this is us, my sisters and myself, welcoming them at the airport. Here's a few more pictures. Oh, there's the one we were looking for. Anyway, that's my dad's mother on the left, my dad, and then his brother Billy. Do you see a resemblance there? My sisters, 2 of my sisters were in California, and they saw videos of Billy, and they said it was just, he walked like my dad. Everything was just unbelievable. Here's another, we had some of our relatives on my mother's side kind of meet them, and we had a great time. It was a sad time too because my mother died the weekend they were here, but anyway, it was good to have them here. And that's us saying goodbye to them at the airport. Anyway, in closing, I'd like to read the last letter to my dad. October 26, 2018. Dear Dad, winter is fast approaching, and it looks as if my journey to find your birth family and share with you what you've so longed to know throughout your lifetime has finally been accomplished. Although I don't have proof beyond a reasonable doubt as few would require, I have no doubt regarding the family we now know to be your birth family. It took Razzie's story to Mom, a tremendous amount of research, DNA, and family photos to pull it all together. By George, I think we've got it. I have struggled through so much of this as your birth family harbored a great deal of pain and heartache through the years. I cried in the shower the morning I learned that 3-year-old Gladys had drowned following her siblings to school. I think of your grandparents, William and Margaret, and feel so much the sadness and anguish of their lives. Back then, there was no avenue for them to relieve the sorrows of losing 6 children, no grief counseling, nowhere to turn but to their faith, which had to have been rattled at times, and sadly, it seems, to alcohol. I guess there's a lesson in there for all of us. At any rate, I believe each surviving child after each loss paid the price of that sorrow. In the end, the heavy price in one way or another seemed to have fallen to William and Margaret's 5 grandchildren, Julia, Margie, Billy, Chelis's daughter, Catherine, the little I know of her, and to you, Dad. Your birth mother, Lydia Carpenter, alias Josephine Brown, would live a short life. Her contributions were many in that short time. Not only did Lydia strive to set the bar for excellence in education during her teaching career, but she seemed to impact in a very positive way those with whom she surrounded herself. Her legacy was 3 children. Each, it seemed, lived a life of purpose. But there's no doubt there was sadness about Lydia, keeping close to her heart the child that she would never nurture or know. Vine and Tom, who are my sister and brother-in-law, were recently in Lake Tahoe with friends, Dad. They went to McKinney's Bay and placed some flowers in the water in memory of Lydia, a very sweet gesture. Your siblings, Margie and Billy, lives were forever changed that night on Lake Tahoe. The cost of losing their mother in that tragic accident was beyond what any young children should have to pay. In time, they found love, married, and shared with their children the nurturing lessons they had received from their short time with their mother. Their loss, however, was forever in their hearts, and their children felt that sadness through the years. And you, Dad? Well, I remember when Bonnie and I took you to Rochester for a checkup for your cancer. Mom was recovering from your accident that you had together and was in the care of your 3 younger daughters. The nurse came out to ask you some questions regarding your family history, Dad. Of course, you could tell her nothing, because you knew nothing. When she left, you looked at me with tears in your eyes and said, "It's tough being a bastard." I know you're hurt and sorrow through the years, but looking back over the circumstances of your birth, adoption, and your life after, I can't help thinking what a gift you received. The loss of your birth mother, although different from your siblings' loss, was difficult, I know. But looking at the gift she gave you, you must see your life was filled with wonderful blessings. As for me and my happily ever after, well, let's just say I'm content. In my mind, I pictured Sheas and Lydia arriving in Butte by train from California, with you all wrapped up in a blanket, healthy and beautiful. When the train arrives in Butte, the 3 of you stay in your compartment until Dr. McGinn and his wife board the train. There's a final goodbye and a tearful handover. There is so much emotion in that compartment, but there's also a sigh of relief and promise of a better tomorrow for both you and your birth mother. You're carried off the train by Mrs. McGinn, escorted by Dr. McGinn. They're on their way to meet with Judge Edward Lamb in his chambers at the Butte Courthouse. Josephine Brown will be there, whoever she was. You are the answered prayers of Helen and Richard Bowman. Moments later, your Uncle Sheas and your birth mother, Lydia, step off the train and back into Butte history. Sheas brings Lydia to her new apartment, where he will stay until she is anchored. Of course, my happily ever after is just my imagination, not rooted in any clear facts, but felt from my heart. So for now, my story ends. Perhaps some lingering questions will be answered down the road, but I am satisfied with the knowledge unearthed. I know there will be happy gatherings with some of your birth family in the future. I so look forward to our meeting. As for you, Dad, I will keep seeing you and each of your grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Your influence and reach is beyond measure. You are so missed. Your pal, Debbie. P.S. I love you. That's my story.
That was very good.
Thank you.
Very good.
Any questions? Anybody? Yes.
Yeah, how far back do they go where they kept records on adoptions?
Well, you know, when I was serving in the legislature, and one day I went over to Helena, or one day I went over across the street when we had a break, and I talked to them. And my dad's was a private adoption, so they had no records of that. So I don't know how far they would go back in terms of, you know, adoption records that were through the courts and stuff. This was obviously a private one, so I don't know. But they kept it pretty. Hey, Tom.
I was wondering how he got that nickname Dutch.
You know, this is funny. I'm forgetting the man's name now. I ran into him at Safeway, and he said to me, "Are you Rich Bowman's daughter?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, I'm probably the last person alive that should have arranged your parents' wedding. And I said, oh really? And he said, do you know how your dad got his name Dutch? And I said, no. And he said, my dad's name was Dutch, and he said when your dad was little, he followed my dad everywhere. Whatever he did, he helped him with projects, and he said, so then they started calling him Little Dutch. And I apologize, I can't think of that guy's name now, he's just a lovely guy, so. Anyway, that's where he got his name Dutch. Yes, Tina.
It occurs to me that the Republicans are kind of like the evil empire too. However, when you go back to the beginning of the suffrage movement, you find that by and large, there wouldn't have been a successful suffrage movement without the Republicans.
The Republicans.
Yeah.
It was almost as though the ideals of one group passed on to the other, and the bitterness and exclusivity passed on to the other one. I mean, it's like they exchange roles. So that if you find a Republican in your family, which there were a lot in my family, that dates back to the Civil War or World War I or the suffrage movement, you can be proud. You don't have to be embarrassed.
Yeah. You know, I would love to know more about her. I mean, I think she's going to be my next project because I think she led a very interesting life. And what I also found was very interesting that these women went to college. I mean, you know, that was back in the day. This would be, you know.
Well, they participate in athletics. Look at in our house, we have a CYO basketball trophy for a female.
Yeah.
And my husband picked it up at a yard sale. And it was those eras where women's sports were really big.
You bet.
And then they were all secluded after, primarily after World War II,
Until Title IX.
so that we could be back to normal.
Anybody else? I have a couple of books to give away, and so if you haven't put your name in here and you want a book, I'll send you this thing right there. Is this you, Bobby?